John Thatch was 37 years old when he decided that if the Navy couldn't outbuild the Japanese, he would outthink them. He was a quiet man, not the swaggering type of pilot you'd expect to find in a fighter cockpit. Thick glasses, soft voice, a calm, deliberate way of speaking. To his men, he looked more like a schoolteacher than a warrior, but under that calm exterior lived one of the sharpest minds in aviation history. It was 1941, months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The war had already spread across Asia and the Pacific. The Japanese Zero had become a legend. Light, fast, capable of impossible turns that made Western engineers question their own physics. American pilots who faced it in China came back shaken. "You can't fight it," one said. "You can only try not to die." The Navy's answer was the Grumman F4F Wildcat, a rugged, thick-skinned fighter that could take a beating but moved like a bulldog chasing a ghost. It couldn't climb as fast, couldn't turn as tight, couldn't match the Zero in almost anything that mattered. To most, it was a hopeless contest. But Thatch refused to believe that the Japanese held a monopoly on skill. He studied reports, sketches, and combat logs from the Flying Tigers, reading every word about the Zero's maneuvers. The conclusion was brutal but clear. In a fair fight, the Wildcat would lose. So Thatch decided never to fight fair again. One late night, sitting alone in his quarters at Naval Air Station San Diego, he spread out 2 matchsticks on a table. The room was silent except for the ticking of a clock and the hum of a single desk lamp. He slid the matchsticks back and forth, simulating 2 aircraft flying side by side. When one turned left, the other turned right, and they crossed, back and forth, weaving, each covering the other's tail. Then he leaned back and smiled. That was it. That was the answer. If 2 planes could move like one, always turning toward each other instead of away, they could create a living, moving crossfire. The enemy chasing one would be forced into the line of fire of the other. It wasn't speed that mattered, but geometry, teamwork, and timing. He called it the weave. Over the next weeks, he drilled his men relentlessly. The first sessions were awkward, even dangerous. The pilots were trained to break away from threats, not fly directly toward each other. "You want us to collide, Commander?" one joked nervously. "No," Thatch said evenly. "I want you to survive." They practiced over the California coast, looping, crossing, rolling through the air in synchronized arcs. At first it looked chaotic, but soon the pattern emerged. 2 planes twisting like threads of a rope, impossible to cut apart. And then, in December 1941, the world changed. Pearl Harbor. Thatch and his squadron listened to the radio in stunned silence as reports came in. The fleet burning, the Arizona gone, the Pacific lost in a single morning. For the United States Navy, it was not just a defeat. It was humiliation. Within weeks, the Pacific became a Japanese ocean. Their carriers, planes, and submarines struck everywhere at once. The Zero dominated every sky it entered. American pilots died faster than replacements could be trained. But in the middle of that chaos, aboard the carrier Yorktown, John Thatch was ready. He'd refined his pattern, memorized its rhythm, trusted it completely. On June 4th, 1942, at Midway, he got his chance. The sun was blinding that morning, a white fire over a blue desert. Thatch led 6 Wildcats into the air, climbing to intercept a wave of Japanese bombers heading for the American fleet. High above them, a dozen Zeros escorted the bombers, predators circling their prey. Thatch knew the odds. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and flying slower planes, but numbers didn't scare him. Equations did, and his equations told him the weave would work. "Bassett," he said to his wingman, "on my mark, we go into the weave. Keep your eyes open and trust it. The first Zero dove. Its cannons flashed, rounds slicing through the sky. Bassett yanked left. Thatch rolled right. They crossed paths in midair, barely 50 feet apart. The Japanese pilot followed Bassett's tail, the logical choice, and in doing so, flew straight into Thatch's guns. Thatch fired a 2-second burst. The Zero exploded. The others came next, 3, then 4, diving in formation. But every time one Zero latched onto a Wildcat, the other turned and attacked from the side. It was a perfect rhythm: cross, fire, reverse, repeat. By the time the dogfight ended, 3 Zeros were down and all 6 Wildcats had survived. Back aboard the Yorktown, deck crews cheered. Pilots who had watched from below could hardly believe it. The legendary Zero had finally met its match, not in machinery, but in mathematics. The Thatch weave spread through the Navy like wildfire. Within weeks, every pilot in the Pacific was training in the maneuver. Over the Coral Sea, the Solomons, and Guadalcanal, the once invincible Zeros found themselves caught in deadly traps they couldn't escape. By late 1942, the kill ratios told the story. Where once American pilots had been slaughtered 3-1, they were now winning by the same margin. Thatch didn't care about the numbers. He cared about the men who came home because of them. Every time he trained a new pilot, he started the same way. "Turn toward your wingman," he'd say. "Never away. If you turn away, you die alone. If you turn toward him, you live together." He meant it. The Thatch weave wasn't just a tactic, it was a philosophy. It turned solitary duels into coordinated survival. It taught trust under fire, discipline under chaos. By 1943, Thatch was promoted to commander and became an instructor for the Navy's Air Tactics School. His ideas reached every carrier, every air group, every new batch of aviators sent into the Pacific meat grinder. One pilot, Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare, the Navy's first ace, became one of Thatch's closest friends and strongest advocates. O'Hare himself would later die in combat, flying the same kind of coordinated night attack that Thatch had helped pioneer. After his death, O'Hare Airport would bear his name, and in every way his legacy was tied to the man who taught him how to survive. As the war dragged on, Thatch moved from cockpit to classroom to command bridge. He developed new tactics for larger formations, combining the weave with dive bombing and interception strategies. By 1944, he was shaping not just dogfights, but entire battles. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Navy shot down nearly 400 Japanese aircraft in a single day. Many of those kills came from pilots using the Thatch weave as their foundation. When the war ended in 1945, John Thatch was one of the few tacticians whose ideas had survived the transition from theory to blood-soaked reality. He had proven that intellect could beat innovation, that brains could beat brawn. But Thatch himself wasn't a man who celebrated. When asked what victory meant to him, he said, "It means fewer widows." After the war, he stayed in the Navy. He helped transition American pilots from propeller-driven planes to jets. He wrote doctrine on carrier tactics, helped design air defense systems, and eventually became an admiral. Even in the Cold War, the lessons of the weave lived on. At Miramar and Pensacola, instructors taught it to new jet pilots, not as a relic, but as a principle. "Don't fight alone," they'd say. Even at Mach 2, remember Thatch. By the 1960s, naval aviation had changed beyond recognition. Missiles replaced machine guns. Radar replaced eyesight. But at its heart, air combat was still about trust. Two pilots covering each other, two minds sharing one purpose. That was Thatch's true legacy. He died quietly in 1981, surrounded by family and former comrades. At his funeral, hundreds of pilots stood in silence as four F-14 Tomcats roared overhead, one peeling off in the missing man formation, the symbol of a fallen aviator. As the sound faded, a veteran leaned to a young pilot beside him and whispered, "That man saved more lives with 2 matches than most with 1,000 bullets." They were right, because long before he became an admiral, before the medals and the speeches, John Thatch had sat alone at a desk studying 2 simple sticks of wood, and in that silence he'd found an answer, one that would change the fate of every man who ever took to the Pacific sky. Even today, in classrooms and flight simulators, his name is still spoken with quiet respect. The Thatch weave remains part of air combat training, a relic of propeller days, but timeless in its wisdom. 2 aircraft crossing paths, turning toward each other, never away. The pattern lives on, in the air, in the minds of those who fly, and in the simple truth that brilliance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just thinks. And somewhere out over the Pacific, where sunlight meets horizon, 2 faint contrails still trace that eternal motion, weaving through history, forever protecting one another.